Anyway, the reason you're here today is that Catherine Adelman, who has presented many programs here at the library, is back. And I will say a few words about Catherine, who began her piano studies at the age of 6 in Montreal, Canada. She studied at the Quebec Conservatoire, at McGill and Concordia Universities in Montreal, and with Bernard Rose in New York City. She performs frequently in the United States and Canada in solo and chamber music recitals and as an accompanist. She has played on the East End in Greenport, Montauk, Blue Point, and East Hampton, as well as in Southampton with soprano Kate Herney, pianist Alvin Novak, who's making a grand entrance, and violinist Stanichka Dimitrova. And I want to mention that Alvin is the source of many of our musical events here. He is the reason that we have a piano here at the library. Catherine has recorded Bach's Goldberg variations and a Beethoven program of sonatas and bagatelles. She's also presented over 20 lectures on great composers, including this Music at Midday series here at the library, a program she conceived of in 2006. Catherine Adelman also holds a PhD from McGill University in renewable resources microbiology, and she now lives in Ottawa. We are so grateful to her for being with us. Please welcome Catherine Adelman.
And I'd like to say we're so grateful to Penny and this library. What a wonderful series of programs. I'm talking today about Franz Schubert, one of my favorite composers. It's another story of a tragic genius. He lived a very short life. We think of composers who died very young, like Mozart, who was 35, and Mendelssohn, who was only 37. Schubert was only 31 when he left us, and it's almost inconceivable that he accomplished what he did. In fact, he wrote over 1,500 completed pieces of music and many masterpieces, which puts him up in terms of productivity with Bach, who was the grand champion. So I'm going to start with a piece that he wrote in the last year of his life, and it's one of the 8 impromptus that he wrote. This is in A flat major, and you'll all recognize it. You can hear me? Yes. So Schubert, that was sort of typical, that there's a sort of serene opening and closing and this very passionate central part. So that'll come back in other pieces that I'll play. He was born in 1797 in Vienna. And in Vienna, of course, it was the hub of music in Europe. And Beethoven and Haydn were still alive and still living in Vienna when he was born. Apparently, he never met either one of them, but Beethoven was his absolute idol, and he loved Haydn as well. And he was going to end up in the same school that Haydn went to. He came from a lower middle class family. His father was a very religious Catholic school teacher, and he ran a small school in his own home. And Schubert was one of 14 children. Only 5 survived to adulthood, which was a little worse than the usual 50% at the time. He was poor all of his life. He led a very bohemian life, and he never himself owned a piano. So he and his friends would share food and lodgings when they had them, and that was the way he lived most of his life. His father was very musical, and so were the rest of the family. His brothers and his father taught him violin and piano, but he outstripped them very quickly. He was composing already at the age of 7, so he had that composer's gene. And he started taking lessons from the local organist in Oregon, and he was taking theory and singing lessons as well. But according to the local organist, he said, "If I wished to instruct him in anything fresh, he already knew it. Consequently, I merely conversed with him and watched in silent astonishment." So he was obviously a prodigy at a very young age. And at the age of 7, he became known in the neighborhood, I guess, for his wonderful singing voice. And he was auditioned by the famous Salieri, who was Mozart's big rival. Salieri was a big wheel in Vienna, and he was accepted to the Imperial Court Chapel Choir. So he was able to hear all the great, great music performed beautifully from a very young age, which was a great opportunity. At the age of 9, at the age of 11, he was accepted as a full-time room and board paid for student at St. Stephen's School, which was the greatest school in Vienna for non-aristocrats, and this was associated with the imperial court. So there was a great orchestra. It was also a very excellent academic program, and he excelled in everything apparently. But having the great orchestra in the school allowed him to write for it, so he wrote his first symphony for that orchestra, which was performed. And he met a lot of lifelong friends there. All of them worshipped Schubert immediately. His friend, who was the director of the orchestra, his name was Joseph von Spahn, became his friend for the rest of his life. And he said that Schubert had learned everything from God. And you hear this sort of type of phrase referring to Schubert over and over. At the age of 15, he wrote his first, the string quartets that are still survive, but apparently he had written many more before that. And he was known in his early, there's a couple of little piano pieces that still exist from his very early time, and they're kind of characteristic because he's already writing very long pieces, and some people criticize him for not knowing when to stop. And he also was modulating constantly, and he does that. It's a very sort of strong characteristic of Schubert, that he goes through many, many, many keys and goes back and forth between major and minor constantly. So those are characteristics that he continued. At the age of 17, he declined a scholarship to continue his studies, so he could have gone on into a law degree or theology or something like that. He decided to devote himself to composing, and so he quit school. Luckily, he was not quite 5 feet tall, so he wasn't allowed to go into the army. And of course, this was the time of the Napoleonic Wars. There had been a cannonball came through the roof of the school at one point while he was there. So he did not go into the army. He joined his father's school and he started teaching the youngest children, and he hated it. He was apparently not a very good teacher. He used to slap the kids around, apparently, which was typical, I suppose, in those days. But despite the fact that he was teaching all day, he was composing like a fiend, and in that 15 months after he finished school, He completed 150 songs, which is hard to imagine, as well as, I have it written here, the first of his 6 masses in F, and several other things. That mass was performed, and it was a great success. And the soprano who sang in it was his only sort of romantic link with the female world. She was 15 and apparently a great soprano, and they were romantically linked for a while. But later on, I'll just mention this, his friends described him generally as indifferent to women, and it's now generally accepted that he was gay, which was something that I didn't know until recently. He never spoke of marriage after the age of 19, and he did write in his diary, "To a free man, matrimony is a terrifying thought. The only person he ever referred to as his beloved was his friend and very close confidant, an artist named Moritz von Schwind, who's very gifted and has paintings in great collections all over the world, including at the Metropolitan Museum." He referred to many of his male friends with the "du," right, as opposed to the more formal, I think of it in French, "tu" and "vous." So he was very, very close with many men, and his circle was always with men. There are no letters from him to women or from women, but many, many among his male friends. So it's well known now that he was a gay man. Some of the songs, the early songs that he wrote, were extremely popular right away among his own group. And I'm going to play a little bit of one of them called Gretchen and Spinrad. This is based on text by Goethe. And there was this great flowering of this German Renaissance in literature at the time. And his friends were all mad about this poetry and literature. And so he was reading a lot of Goethe and Schiller and Heine and so on. And this is based on the story of Faust, Gretchen and Spinrad. She's been abandoned by her lover Faust, and she's sitting at the spinning wheel, and you hear the spinning wheel going round and round. You hear the treadle with her kicking her foot on the spinning wheel, and she's relating in the song how she's been abandoned and her heart is broken. And the way that Schubert describes her state in the music and what she's doing at the spinning wheel, and also he brings in these new harmonies that are incredibly intense. So there's a lot of frontier work, a lot of new things going on. He was a real innovator in terms of music. I'll just play you a little bit of this Gretchen at the spinning wheel. So all through the piece, there's this pattern in the right hand, that's the spinning wheel. And in the left hand, you hear the pedal of the spinning wheel, and she's sort of kicking it to keep the spinning wheel going. I'll play that together a little bit. Then she sings above it about her sad love affair. And she goes on relating more and more agony, how this has affected her. And finally, suddenly, the spinning wheel stops, and she's remembering their first kiss. And on the word kiss, there's this excruciating ninth chord, which is really rare at this time. And then slowly the spinning wheel starts again. So I'll just play you a tiny bit. unfortunately, I'm not a singer, but this big pause on the word kiss, the diminished ninth chord, and then she slowly starts to spin again. It was an incredible success. He couldn't get a publisher, of course, though. He also wrote around this time another one on a text by by Goethe, called the Erlkönig, and this is another very dramatic piece with a father who's riding as fast as he can on his galloping horse with his small son behind him on the horse, and they're trying to escape from the Erlkönig, who's this demon fairy who likes to grab little children and take them down to the netherworld. And it's, I'll play you a tiny bit of this. I actually can't play it because I think my arm will fall off if I play it. Repeated note like that goes on page after page after page with this frantic father trying to escape from the Erlkönig, and of course he does not succeed. They're unbelievably, these pieces grab you immediately. He was known for his songs long before he was known for anything else. Again, he couldn't get this published. That same year, when he was writing these things and he had stopped, he had quit school and he was teaching at his father's school, he met a young man named Franz von Schober. He was an aristocrat. His father had died. He was living with his mother in a very elegant house in Vienna. And he was a very charismatic young man, very bright. He was a poet and an actor. And he had a whole circle of young men around him, and they had a literary group. They would get together for readings several times a week. And he was shown some songs by Schubert, and he was taken by them immediately, and he went and sought out Schubert and found him at his father's school, correcting homework. And he immediately convinced Schubert to stop teaching at his father's school and move in with him and his mother and devote himself to writing music, which Schubert decided to do. And this was a huge event in his life, so he moved into his new friend's house, and he composed like mad. Schober also gave him some of his own texts to use to be set to music. And one of them is a very famous one called An die Musik, to music, and it's the text is, "You noble art," they were completely music crazy, these guys. "You noble art, in how many gray hours when life's mad tumult wraps around me, have you kindled my heart to warm love, have you transported me into a better world." He joined von Schober's reading group and met many people who became his lifelong friends as well. And he was also introduced by von Schober to somebody who was very influential, a very famous baritone at the time named Michael Vogel. And Vogel loved Schubert's songs, and quite quickly they formed a very strong bond, and they went touring to the Upper Alps and performing all the way, and it was a very successful tour. After about a year at von Schober's mother's house, he decided that he was absolutely broke and he had had enough, and he moved back to his father's house and started teaching at the school again. But he was saved from too much of that by an invitation from the Esterhazy family, and this is the same family that were patrons of Haydn for so many years, to come and teach the two Esterhazy princesses at the Hungarian castle in the countryside for the summer. And so he went there for 5 months and taught little Princess Marie and Caroline. And they were terrific little pianists, apparently. So he wrote a lot of four-hand music for them, for which we are all eternally grateful. He wrote over 50 pieces of music for them, and many of them are concert pieces. They're fantastic. And but he did feel isolated there. He wrote in a letter to Schober, he wrote, "I am alone with my beloved here, and I have to hide her in my room, in my pianoforte and in my breast. Although this often makes me sad, it elevates me the more." So he's talking about music, of course. And he was it shows that he was really self-identifying as an artist and as an outsider also. By this time, he had written more than 300 songs, 4 Singspiels, 5 symphonies, 7 string quartets, so they're just pouring out of him. It's absolutely incredible. Other songs that he wrote that you all know, I'll just play you a tiny bit of this called The Trout. And this is the little motif for the trout. And you hear that over and over during the piece. And it's a story of this lovely little fish that's swimming in this beautiful stream, and of course a fisherman comes along eventually and catches it, so it's another tragic story. I have to say that I bought, a little digression, I bought a new washing machine this year, and I put my clothes in and went through the first cycle, and at the end of the cycle, it went doodle-doodle-doo-doo. So it shows how Schubert's music has just invaded culture. He also wrote Who is Sylvia? He wrote the great Ave Maria that we all remember, Marian Anderson standing in front of the Lincoln Memorial singing in front of 75,000 people on the Mall. Because she wasn't allowed to sing in Constitution Hall because she was black, the DAR would not allow her to sing there. So this was at the beginning of the Second World War. Although his new friend Michael Vogel was singing the Erlkönig and Gretchen am Spinnrad and many of his songs, still he could not get a publisher, which is hard to imagine now. So some of his friends got together and they set up a subscription and had some plates made and published the Erlkönig to subscribers. And it was a massive success. So the next thing, they took their earnings and they published Gretchen at the Spinning Wheel. Again, it was a massive success. And they were able to publish 20 of Schubert's songs this way, which allowed them to be disseminated and for his name to become more and more well-known. So this was a great help when the publishers were still very, very slow. He got his first commission around this time to write a cantata called Prometheus. Apparently that was also very successful, but it's now lost. And around this time also, the famous Schubertiads started. The first one was in von Schober's mother's house when she was out of town. So apparently they stayed up drinking until 3 in the morning. But what they were opportunities for Schubert to play and sing all of his new stuff. And his friends were absolutely, couldn't get enough of him. So the Schubertiads became a real tradition. I'll play you one of the little, many, many small piano pieces that he wrote. He wrote hundreds of little waltzes and marches and so on. And this is called one of the Moments Musicaux. It's number 3 in F minor, and you'll recognize this too. Completely charming. I shortened it a little bit, but His daily routine consisted of getting up at 6 in the morning and starting to compose right away. And he composed straight through to 1 o'clock in the afternoon, smoking his pipe all the time. So it's funny to think of these composers smoking pipes. For some reason, Johann Sebastian Bach also smoked a pipe the whole time that he composed. And then he would have lunch for a couple of hours smoking as well. And then he would go back to composing, and in the evenings he would go out drinking with his friends. There was quite a bit of drinking, apparently. Or he would go to a Schubertiad or one of the many literary evenings. So very, very busy. But there was a darker side, and this is mentioned many times in letters among his friends, that von Schober had a sort of pernicious influence over him. So Schubert sounds like a very naive, modest young man, not sophisticated at all. And von Schober, from this aristocratic family, very charismatic, was, they thought, leading him astray. And this really dismayed his friends. The comments in their letters are things like that Schubert was living an extravagant and loose lifestyle, and intense and debilitating, and there were clear implications of sexual excess. So we don't know, everything was in code, of course. So it was as if he had a double nature, this very high idealistic, poetic nature, and then this sort of hedonist side. So he was definitely burning the candle at both ends. And finally it caught up with him when he was 26 years old, and he was diagnosed with syphilis. So that was endemic, of course, in the main urban centers in Europe at the time. Up to 20% of the population was infected with syphilis, and there was no cure. Of course, there were no antibiotics. The only treatments were with concoctions containing mercury, and mercury itself had horrible side effects, so dizziness and nerve damage and headaches and so on. So, and he had terrible symptoms right away as well, terrible rashes, and he was very sick. And just at the moment when his name was starting to be really famous, he was being reviewed favorably constantly now. He was being compared to Beethoven, who was his idol, and being invited constantly, and suddenly he was confined to his home and hospitalized several times. So it was a terrible disaster. He wrote to a friend the following year, "I feel myself to be the most unhappy and wretched creature in the world. Imagine a man whose most brilliant hopes have perished, to whom retiring to bed each night, I hope that I may not wake up again. Joyless and friendless I should pass my days if Schwind did not visit me sometimes and turn on me a ray of those sweet days of the past." So Schwind was his beloved, at least he's referred to as his beloved. And yet, in this dark and terrible time, and this is where I sort of feel like he's become a saint, he somehow found the strength of character to throw himself into his work even more. And so he worked harder than ever. His compositions just poured out of him. A lot of them were very pathos-laden, a lot of string quartets like Death and the Maiden and so on. But a lot of very upbeat things like the octet as well. And he wrote his first great song cycle, Die schöne Müllerin, the beautiful miller's daughter, I think, which was an incredible step forward in terms of Lieder, and it's of course a central part of the Lieder repertoire. It's a series of, I don't know, about 20 pieces, based on this romantic ideal of the isolated, the wandering youth and the isolated artist and the unrequited lover, which was sort of this romantic, this was Schubert stepping forward into the romantic period, being very passionate and much less basing his music on the sort of logic and form of the classical period. His beloved Schwind, who visited him quite often, wrote in a letter to Schober, "If you go visit him now, he says, 'Hello, how are you? Good,' and then he just puts his head down and goes on writing." So one of the things that he wrote at this time was also the incidental music to a play called Rosamunde, which you'll also recognize. And he was being commissioned now for this kind of thing, and he was getting much better paid occasionally. the many themes from the play Rosamund. He used that to start one of his impromptus. So that one of those 8 impromptus is a set of theme and a set of variations based on that Rosamund theme. So that's just the beginning of the impromptu. In 1828, he organized a concert of his own music. And this is the first time that he had done this. And it was a great success. He made a lot of money, and true to form, he took the money and took all of his friends out to hear Paganini, who was playing in Vienna at the time. So this was the sort of bohemian lifestyle. The year before, he had attended Beethoven's premiere of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. So he was in that audience when this old deaf composer was conducting, and you all know the story of Beethoven continuing to conduct after the symphony had finished and having to be turned to face the audience that was all waving their handkerchiefs at him. So Schubert was in that audience. And not long after that, Beethoven died. And Schubert was now well known enough so that he was asked to be a torchbearer in the great funeral procession for Beethoven that stopped everything in Vienna. But this, in 1828, the year after, when he did his big concert, was his final year. He had rallied somewhat. He had taken another big trip through the Austrian Alps, and it had been a very good time with Michael Vogel. And he wrote some great, very upbeat things. It was maybe his happiest time just before this ending. And I'm going to play you a little bit of a sonata that he wrote there in D major, and just to give you an idea of how upbeat he felt. It sort of reminds me of Waldstein because it's got a lot of repeated chords at the beginning, and I'm just going to play a little bit of the exposition and a little bit into the development section. This is a sonata for piano in D major. So it doesn't sound like what we think of Schubert. Like he was feeling terrific when he wrote that. And so he was writing masterpiece after masterpiece. In his last year, he wrote more string quartets. He wrote an amazing song cycle again called the Winterreise. Again, the sort of wandering youth, unrequited love, and the young, unrecognized artist. He also wrote another song cycle called Schwanengesang. And 3 very famous piano sonatas. And the last one is the Great B flat, is one of his most famous pieces. And he wrote it just three months before he died. I'm just going to play you a little bit of it. But I don't know if you read the New Yorker and you've read the music columns, there's a terrific writer named Alex Ross, and he wrote about this particular sonata at one point. There's a trill in it that sounds like this in the bass, and it just comes out of nowhere and it just disappears, and it comes several times. And Alex Ross was interviewing Andras Schiff, actually, the pianist, and Andras Schiff called that trill the trill of doom. And Alex Ross called this sonata a premature communication from the beyond. It really is sort of an uncanny piece of music, and I'm just going to play a little bit of it, but probably you've heard it. And if you're looking for a terrific recording of this and all of the Schubert sonatas, Richard Good is pretty unbeatable. And I think there's old Schnabel recordings also, but Richard Good is, he's recorded them at least, I think, twice. Also his Beethoven is pretty amazing. His last instrumental work was the great C major quintet, and that's maybe one of the greatest pieces of music of all time. I absolutely love it. It's another call from another world. It's really sublime. In September of 1828, Schubert moved in with his beloved older brother, Ferdinand, who we owe a lot to. Ferdinand taught him a lot of music and really looked after him in his illness as well. And he stayed there until he died. He was looked after by his friends. They played him one of the late Beethoven quartets at his request just before he died. And he asked to be buried beside Beethoven, which he was. His epitaph reads, "The art of music has entombed here a rich treasure, but even fairer hopes." So, of course, he died so young, but his friends who had put this epitaph together really had no idea what kind of an effect and impact that his music was going to have on the musical world in the long run. Less than a quarter of his music had been published by the time he died. His brother Ferdinand pulled together 600, as many as he could find, 600 songs, and had them published finally by Diabelli, and that paid part of his medical bills. But most of the rest of his music was either given to Diabelli, where it was put on shelves in some back room and left to gather dust, or Ferdinand kept piles and piles of his manuscripts, and that was it. They did not see the light of day until about 10 years later, when Schumann, who I'm going to talk about next week, showed up in Vienna, actually trying to catch his beloved Clara, and looked up Ferdinand and went to his home and discovered these stacks and stacks of incredible manuscripts. Among them, the chamber music, the symphonies. And he got his friend Felix Mendelssohn interested. And the two of them put together a performance of Schubert's great C major symphony, which is probably his best symphony, a magnificent piece. And I think it was performed in Leipzig, I'm not sure exactly. But it immediately put Schubert on the map in terms of orchestral music. And really, his reputation up till then had been based mostly on his songs. After Schumann and Mendelssohn researched a lot of this lost music, Brahms and Liszt also got involved a little bit later. And then later on again, Sir Arthur Sullivan of Gilbert and Sullivan and Sir George Grove, who wrote the Grove Dictionary of Music, they got together also and dug up more of these unpublished manuscripts. So finally, in 1897, a complete edition of Schubert's music was published, and that came to 39 volumes or something, which is pretty amazing. And there was a new edition that came out in 1967, I think. So we owe Schubert so much. I'm going to finish with another one of his impromptus. And again, this was one that he wrote in his last year, and it's again in Opus 90. And this is in G-flat major, and you'll probably recognize this too. had a very short but very interesting life.
I don't want to interrupt the questions because we do have time for them, but I wanted to just give you this.
I give you Schubert.
But the other thing I want to say is, Catherine, there's no one like you, and I cannot imagine a more wonderful way to learn about composers or to gain a greater appreciation for music than what you do for us, which is very...
It's so lovely to see so many people here who are interested.
No, we're just so happy that you're here, and I'm pretty sure you'll see some of the same faces next week. So go ahead with questions if you have, or comments.
No? Okay.
In the concert, did he do the performance?
He apparently himself wasn't a great pianist, so he couldn't do what Beethoven and Mozart did. You know, they were such virtuosos, so they could play the concerts of their own music and publicize them that way. So he wasn't a big virtuoso, so he needed his friends to play for him. Some of his stuff is difficult to play, but apparently he couldn't play his own music a lot of the time. Well, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.